After my husband died, his children made it clear that they wanted everything. The estate, the business, all of it without exception. My lawyer urged me again and again to fight back, insisting that I shouldn't give in so easily. But I calmly responded that they could take it all. People around me thought I had completely lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers without hesitation. The children were smiling confidently, until their lawyer suddenly turned pale as he read the line stating that I was glad to have them there. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The funeral flowers were still fresh when they began trying to tear my life apart. I sat in Harold's leather chair in his home office, the very same chair where he had spent countless evenings going through documents and planning the future we once shared. 22 years of marriage. And now I was expected to accept that the two men standing before me had the right to decide what would happen to me. Chloe, Harold's eldest son, carried his father's death like a perfectly tailored expensive suit, fitting him in every way that benefited him. At 45, he had the same commanding presence Harold once had, but without any of the warmth. His steel-gray eyes moved over me with the cold precision of a businessman judging a poor investment. When he addressed me, his voice carried that familiar patronizing tone I had grown to resent over the years, as he explained that there were practical matters that needed to be discussed. Arthur, 3 years younger yet somehow looking older with his thinning hair and softer jawline, stood beside his brother like a loyal second in command. Where Chloe was all sharp edges and calculated intent, Arthur expressed himself through passive aggression hidden behind a mask of concern. He began by saying that he understood how difficult everything had been, emphasizing how sudden their father's death had affected them all. His sympathy sounded forced. It wasn't them who had sat beside Harold during those long nights in the hospital, nor were they the ones making painful decisions about treatment and managing his suffering. They had shown up for the funeral, of course, Chloe flying in from his law practice in San Francisco, and Arthur arriving from Los Angeles, where he ran some vague consulting business. But during the 3 months of Harold's illness, when it truly mattered, I had been alone. I asked what exactly they meant by practical matters. Even as a cold feeling settled inside me, Chloe and Arthur exchanged a look. A silent understanding shaped over years, the kind that shut everyone else out, especially me. Chloe then clarified that the discussion was about the estate, explaining that their father's assets, properties, and business interests needed to be properly distributed. I felt my fingers tighten around the arms of Harold's chair. The leather had been worn smooth by years of his hands resting in the same place, and that familiar texture brought me a small sense of comfort. Harold and I had discussed all of this in detail, and he had reassured me that everything was already taken care of. Arthur responded in a way that suggested I might be overlooking something obvious, explaining that while their father had indeed made provisions, he might not have explained the full complexity of the situation. Chloe then took a thick manila folder from his briefcase and placed it on Harold's desk. The same desk where Harold had kissed me goodbye every morning for 22 years. The folder looked heavy and official, carrying that intimidating presence typical of legal documents. Chloe opened it carefully and began to explain that the will was quite clear. The house in Sacramento, valued at approximately $850,000, would go jointly to him and Arthur. The villa at Lake Tahoe, worth around $750,000, would also go to them. He continued, stating that the business assets, roughly $400,000, would likewise be divided between the two of them. Each number felt like a physical. Our home, the place where Harold and I had built our life together, hosted holidays and talked about growing old side by side, was gone. The villa, where we had spent our honeymoon, celebrated our 10th anniversary, and where Harold had first told me he loved me, was gone as well. I quietly asked what had been left for me. Arthur shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable, while Chloe remained completely calm. He explained that there was a life insurance policy worth $200,000, adding that this amount should be more than enough for my future needs. $200,000 for a 63-year-old woman who had given up her career to support her husband's family, for someone who had spent the past 2 decades managing Harold's household, hosting his business associates, and caring for him throughout his illness. $200,000 to start over. I said that I understood, although in truth I didn't understand anything at all. This couldn't be right. Harold had promised that I would be taken care of, that I would never have to worry about security or stability. "It isn't anything personal," Arthur said, and the artificial softness in his voice made my skin crawl. He went on to explain that their father had always intended for the family assets to remain within the bloodline, asking if I understood what that meant. Bloodline. As though the 22 years I had spent as Harold's wife, and as a stepmother to both of them, counted for nothing. As if loyalty and love somehow mattered less than shared DNA. Chloe added that they were not being unreasonable, explaining that I would be allowed to remain in the house for 30 days while I made arrangements, emphasizing that this was, in their view, more than fair. Fair. They truly believed that 30 days was enough time to dismantle an entire life. I looked around the office, taking in every familiar detail that would soon belong to someone else. The bookshelf where Harold kept his collection of first-edition novels. The window overlooking the garden we had planned together. And the small photograph on his desk, not of Chloe or Arthur, but of the two of us on our wedding day, both laughing at something I could no longer recall. Chloe then mentioned that there was one more matter to address, and something in his tone made me immediately look up. He removed another document from the folder, smaller, yet carrying a heavier sense of unease. He explained that during Harold's final illness, significant medical expenses had accumulated. Insurance had covered most of the costs, but approximately $180,000 remained unpaid. Since I had been Harold's wife and had been involved in medical decisions, the responsibility for those bills, he said, was now being directed toward me. For a moment the room seemed unsteady. $180,000 in debt, with only $200,000 from the life insurance, leaving me with barely anything to rebuild my life. I tried to argue that the estate should cover it, but Arthur calmly interrupted, explaining that the estate assets were tied up in probate and under the specific terms of the will, those debts were treated separately from the inherited property. He added that it was unfortunate, but legally that was simply how things worked. I stared at them, these two men who had called me their mother just 3 days earlier at their father's funeral. Chloe stood there in his perfectly pressed suit, his expression cold and unreadable. Arthur, with his softer appearance, spoke with a tone that suggested concern while delivering something far from it. Finally, I said that I needed time to process everything. Chloe agreed smoothly, rising to his feet and adjusting his jacket, telling me to take whatever time I needed. However, he reminded me that the 30-day period would begin the following day, and the medical bills would only become more complicated the longer they remained unpaid. They left me alone in Harold's office, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, and the heavy reality that now pressed down on me. The silence felt overwhelming. There was no comfort, no reassurance, no attempt to find a solution that respected both Harold's wishes and my basic need for stability. I remained there as the afternoon light slowly shifted, casting long shadows across the room. Shadows that seemed to mock the warmth that had once filled this space. My hands drifted to the small drawer in Harold's desk, the one where he kept personal items. Inside, beneath old receipts and business cards, I found something unexpected. A small key I had never seen before. It was made of old brass, worn smooth from use. It didn't seem to match any lock in the house, yet Harold had kept it in such a private place. I couldn't help but wonder why. As I held the key up to the light, I noticed that Arthur's car was still in the driveway. Through the window, I could see him and Chloe standing close together, speaking animatedly. It didn't take much to realize what they were doing. They were celebrating, already dividing what they had claimed, planning their future with what they believed was their inheritance. Not once did they look back at the house where their father's wife sat alone, surrounded by everything she had lost. But as I watched them finally drive away, something unexpected happened. Instead of sinking into despair, a different feeling began to grow inside me. It started faintly, almost like a quiet thought, but it strengthened with each passing second. They believed they had won. They believed they had erased me completely from Harold's legacy, reducing me to nothing more than an inconvenience handled with the bare minimum required by law. What they didn't realize, what they could not possibly have known, was that Harold had always been far more strategic than either of his sons understood. And after 22 years of marriage, I had learned more from him than they ever suspected. The key in my hand seemed to grow warmer, as though it carried a purpose I had yet to discover. Tomorrow I would find out what it unlocked. Tonight, I would let Chloe and Arthur enjoy their victory. Gregory Hayes had been Harold's attorney for 15 years. And in all that time, I had never seen him look as uneasy as he did sitting across from me in his downtown office. His usual composure was gone, replaced by something far more human, quiet concern hidden beneath a professional exterior. "Vanessa," he said as he took off his glasses and cleaned them again, already for the third time in 10 minutes. He went on to say that he had to advise me in the strongest possible terms, emphasizing that this was not the right decision. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 15th-floor office, throwing everything into sharp relief. Below us, the Sacramento River glittered, and somewhere across the water, in those bright office buildings, people were making rational decisions about their lives. I envied them. I told Gregory that I understood his concerns, my voice steadier than I felt, but I made it clear that my mind was already made up. He set his glasses down and leaned forward, his expression serious, explaining that I could still fight this. He spoke about the will, pointing out irregularities and raising questions about Harold's mental state during its final revision. He added that we could contest it, delay probate, and push Chloe and Arthur into negotiations. I had spent the entire sleepless night reading and rereading the documents Chloe had left me, trying to understand how Harold, my Harold, could have written me out of our shared life so completely. The wording felt cold and clinical, reducing 22 years of marriage to a few paragraphs about adequate provision and appropriate arrangements. I asked how long a contest would take. He replied that it could take months, possibly years, but insisted that I would have a real chance. He said he knew Harold well, and this will did not match the man he had known, the same man who had always spoken about me with love and respect. Love and respect. I found myself questioning everything. Had I imagined all those conversations where Harold assured me I would be taken care of? Had I misunderstood his promises that I would never have to worry about my future? Then I asked what I would live on during those months or years. Chloe had made it clear that the medical debt, $180,000, was now my responsibility. Even if I eventually won, I would be bankrupt long before that. Gregory's jaw tightened as he said that Chloe and Arthur were playing hardball, but that was exactly why I shouldn't give them what they wanted. He added that they were counting on me being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight. He was right, of course. Every instinct I had told me this was wrong, that Harold would never have intended to leave me with almost nothing while his sons inherited millions. But instincts didn't pay medical bills or keep a roof over my head. Quietly, I asked what would happen if I simply gave them everything they wanted. Gregory blinked and asked me to repeat myself. I explained that I meant signing whatever documents they required, transferring all claims to the properties, and walking away cleanly. Then I asked how quickly it could be done. He said I couldn't be serious and reminded me that I would be giving up my legal right to challenge anything. I repeated the question, asking again how quickly it could be done. He stared at me for a long moment, his professional composure slipping just enough to show real concern. Finally, he said that if I waived all claims and signed the proper releases, it could be done within a week, maybe two. Then he asked why I would even consider that. I looked out at the river again, watching a small boat moving through the current. The person steering it seemed to know exactly where they were going, as if following an invisible map guiding them forward. I said that fighting would destroy me. Even if I won, I would be a different person by the end of it, bitter, exhausted, and broke. Maybe it was better to accept what was being offered and try to build something new. Gregory leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same focused intensity that had made him one of Sacramento's most successful attorneys. He said that in 30 years of practice, he had never seen a client voluntarily walk away from a 7-figure inheritance, and that there had to be something he was missing. There was something he didn't understand, but I couldn't explain it to him. I couldn't explain the certainty that had been growing in me ever since I found Harold's key. All night I had searched the house, checking every drawer, every cabinet, and every storage space I could think of. Nothing. But the key felt important, like Harold was trying to tell me something from beyond the grave. I said that maybe I was just tired of fighting, tired of being seen as the greedy stepmother trying to take the son's inheritance. Maybe it was easier to let them have what they thought they deserved. Gregory's voice sharpened as he responded that this wasn't about what they thought they deserved. He stressed that it was about what Harold had intended, and he insisted, as both his attorney and his friend, that this will did not reflect Harold's true wishes. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. It was Arthur, asking if we could meet that day to discuss the timeline for transferring the property, adding that he wanted to make the process as smooth as possible for everyone involved. The politeness in his message felt almost worse than Chloe's cold directness. At least Chloe never pretended to care about making anything easier for me. I said that they were already planning the transfer and showed Gregory the message. His expression darkened as he read it. He pointed out that they were rushing me, calling it a classic pressure tactic, and urged me again to reconsider. He told me to take time, to grieve, to process everything I had lost, and warned me not to make irreversible decisions while still in shock. But I wasn't in shock anymore. The numbness that had carried me through Harold's illness and death was fading, replaced by something that felt closer to clarity. I knew I couldn't fight Chloe and Arthur, not with their lawyers, their entitlement, and their deep knowledge of Harold's business affairs. But maybe I didn't have to fight them directly. I asked slowly if I were to sign the papers what exactly I would be giving up. Gregory let out a heavy sigh, as if he already knew the outcome. He explained that I would be signing away all claims to the main house, the Lake Tahoe property, the business assets, and any shared accounts or investments. The only things I would keep were the life insurance payout and any personal property that had belonged to me before the marriage. In return, he said, they would agree to cover the medical debts using estate funds before any distribution, meaning I would not be responsible for those payments. That, at least, was something. It meant I would walk away with the full $200,000, rather than being left with only $20,000 after paying off the debt. It still wasn't enough for long-term security, but it was enough to survive while I figured out what came next. I told him I needed to see the exact wording. Gregory opened his laptop and began typing, saying he would draft something that protected me as much as possible given the situation. But he warned me clearly that once I signed, there would be no going back. If I later discovered something that could have changed my decision, I would have no legal recourse. I said that I understood. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure that I did. The key in my purse seemed heavier than before, a constant reminder that Harold had left something behind, something I still hadn't figured out. I couldn't help but wonder if I was making a mistake by giving in so easily, or if I was following something deeper than logic. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Chloe. He addressed me as Mother, saying that he and Arthur appreciated my cooperation and wanted to make the transition as painless as possible. He suggested finalizing everything by the end of the week. Mother. The word sounded empty. That sense of family concern had been nowhere to be found during Harold's final months, when I had sat alone in hospital waiting rooms. I told Gregory that they wanted everything signed by the end of the week. He said that of course they did. The faster they secured my signature, the less chance I had to reconsider or seek another opinion. Then he looked at me carefully and admitted that something about the situation didn't feel right to him. He suggested that Chloe and Arthur might be afraid I would discover something that could complicate their inheritance, pointing out that people don't usually rush probate unless they have a reason. I had thought the same thing. In all the years I had known them, neither of them had ever been particularly quick or urgent. Chloe was overly methodical, and Arthur was almost slow in how he handled business matters. This sudden urgency felt unnatural. I suggested that maybe they were just eager to move on, though I didn't really believe it myself. Gregory responded that it was also possible they knew something I didn't. He closed his laptop and leaned forward again, asking me one more time if I would at least take 48 hours to think about it. He suggested I sleep on it, talk to someone, a friend, a counselor, anyone who wasn't emotionally involved. I almost laughed. A friend? For 22 years, Harold had been my closest companion. We had let other friendships fade while we focused on building our life together, hosting his business associates, and managing everything at home. I had been his wife and their stepmother, but I had never really figured out who I was on my own. I said that I didn't need 48 hours. I had already made my decision. Gregory watched me for a long moment before finally nodding. He agreed to prepare the documents but insisted that everything be clearly written. Their responsibility for the medical debts, a defined timeline for the insurance payout, and a clause protecting me from any future claims related to Harold's estate. I thanked him. "Don't thank me yet," he said, adding that he might be helping me make the biggest mistake of my life. As I left Gregory's office and walked through the marble lobby toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished walls. The woman staring back at me felt unfamiliar. Yes, she looked older, but there was something else too, something steadier, more grounded. For 22 years, I had been Harold's wife, defined by that role and by my place in his sons' lives. Now, for the first time since his death, I was being forced to understand who Vanessa Hayes Langford really was without those roles. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside. As it descended toward the parking garage, my hand moved to the key in my purse once again. Harold had left me something. I was certain of it. And whatever it was, Chloe and Arthur had no idea it existed. The key turned out to belong to a safety deposit box at First National Bank on J Street, a box I had never known about. I had spent 2 days carefully searching every corner of the house, growing more frustrated with each empty drawer and useless cabinet. It wasn't until I went through Harold's wallet, the one returned by the hospital with his personal belongings, that I found a small business card tucked behind his driver's license. First National Bank, with a handwritten number on the back, 379. The bank manager, a kind woman named Patricia who remembered Harold from occasional visits, guided me down to the vault with quiet sympathy. She explained that Harold had been very specific about that box, noting that only the two of us had access and that he had opened it about 6 months earlier. 6 months ago, right around the time his health had started to decline, when he began having those unexplained business meetings he never fully discussed with me. The box was larger than I expected and heavier as well. Patricia left me alone in a small viewing room, and with slightly trembling hands I lifted the lid. Inside were documents, many of them, but they weren't what I had expected. There were no standard legal papers like wills or insurance policies. Instead, I found personal letters, printed emails, financial records, and what appeared to be investigation reports. The first thing I noticed was a letter in Harold's handwriting, dated 2 months before his death. The envelope was marked for me, with instructions to open it only after reviewing everything else. I set it aside and reached for another document. It was a printed email exchange between Chloe and someone named Adrian Fletcher, dated 8 months earlier. As I read, a chill ran through me. Chloe had written that their father's condition was worsening, and that the doctors believed he might have only 6 months left. He urged Adrian to speed up certain transfer procedures. The reply confirmed that documents had been prepared, and that once Harold signed them, the business assets would be moved into shell companies. It also mentioned that the personal properties could be transferred immediately after his death. When the question about me came up, the response was dismissive, suggesting I wouldn't understand what was happening until it was too late, and that Harold trusted them completely. I read it twice before fully grasping it. They had been planning this for months. While I had been caring for Harold, driving him to appointments, managing his medication, his sons had been preparing to take everything. The next document was a bank statement for an account I had never seen before. Langford Holdings LLC. The balance showed $4,700,000. Beneath it was a handwritten note from Harold explaining that this was our real savings. He wrote that his sons believed his wealth was tied up in the house and business, but he had quietly moved most of it into this account months earlier to protect us. $4,700,000. We hadn't been struggling at all. Harold had been quietly wealthy, while his sons were trying to take advantage of him. My hand shook as I opened the next folder labeled Confidential Investigation. Inside were photographs, financial records, and a report from a private investigator named Daniel Carter. The photos showed Chloe entering and leaving what looked like a high-end casino in Reno, with timestamps indicating repeated visits over the past year. The financial records revealed that he owed $230,000, mostly tied to gambling debts. Arthur's file was just as troubling. His consulting business turned out to be a cover for failed investment schemes. He had lost nearly $300,000 belonging to clients, many of them elderly people who had trusted him with their savings. Both of Harold's sons were buried in debt and legal problems. It suddenly made sense why they were so desperate to secure their inheritance. But the most shocking document was a medical report dated 3 months before Harold's death. It wasn't from his usual doctor. It came from a neurologist I had never heard of. The conclusion was clear. Harold showed no signs of cognitive decline, and his mental state remained sharp. Chloe and Arthur had been implying that Harold wasn't capable of making sound decisions, but this report proved otherwise. He had been fully aware and in control. The final document was another will, completely different from the one Chloe had shown me. This version, dated 6 weeks before Harold's death, left everything to me, while placing Chloe and Arthur's shares into controlled trusts that would pay out over time rather than all at once. A note written in the margin in Harold's own handwriting read that the original document was held by Carter and Associates, not the Hayes firm. My heart began to race as everything started to make sense. There were 2 wills. Somehow, Chloe and Arthur had gotten hold of an older version and were using it to claim the inheritance, while the actual final will had been kept safely with a different law firm. But then another question surfaced. Why hadn't Carter and Associates contacted me after Harold's death? Why was I only discovering all of this now? With unsteady hands, I picked up Harold's letter and carefully opened it. It began with a personal message addressed to me, explaining that if I was reading it, then he was already gone, and that his sons had revealed who they truly were. He apologized for not telling me everything while he was still alive, explaining that he needed to be certain about what they were planning before acting. As I continued reading, Harold described how he had grown suspicious when Chloe and Arthur suddenly became attentive during his illness, not out of care, but because they were positioning themselves to take control of his estate. He explained that he had hired a private investigator, moved the money, and created a plan to protect me. Then came the part that made my breath catch. He wrote that the boys believed they were inheriting the house and the business, but what they didn't know was that both had been heavily mortgaged during the past year. The house carried a debt of $1,200,000, and the business owed $800,000 to creditors. What they thought were valuable assets were, in reality, overwhelming liabilities. I stared at the page, struggling to process it. Harold hadn't just left them something, he had left them a trap. The letter continued, explaining that the life insurance policy they mentioned was real, but not for $200,000. It was actually $500,000, and the additional amount was meant to help me rebuild my life. He also revealed that Gregory Hayes was never meant to handle the estate. He had dismissed that firm 2 months earlier but had not informed them. It seemed that Chloe and Arthur had persuaded him to step back in after Harold's death. The final paragraph made my eyes fill with tears. He explained that he knew his actions might seem harsh, but he couldn't stand by and let them take advantage of me the way they had taken advantage of others. He made it clear that they had made their choices, and now they would have to face the consequences. He reminded me that I deserved more than what they had planned for me, and encouraged me to take the money, start over, and move forward without looking back. Attached to the letter was a business card for Carter and Associates, along with a note instructing me to contact them immediately after reviewing everything in the safety deposit box. I sat in that small windowless room for nearly an hour trying to take it all in. Harold hadn't abandoned me. He had been protecting me all along. And Chloe and Arthur, who had stood at the funeral speaking about family and legacy, were nothing more than opportunists. But another thought began to trouble me. If they were desperate enough to manipulate their dying father, what would they do once they discovered that their inheritance was nothing but debt? Would they come after me? Would they try to force me to help them out of the financial disaster Harold had set for them? Carefully, I placed all the documents back into the safety deposit box, keeping only Harold's letter and the business card, which I slipped into my purse. The next day, I would contact Carter and Associates and learn exactly what Harold had arranged. But that evening I still had to sit across from Chloe and Arthur at dinner, pretending I knew nothing, smiling and nodding as they talked about their future, unaware that what awaited them was not wealth, but debt and consequences. As I drove home, my phone rang. It was Arthur. He spoke warmly, inviting me to dinner with him and Isabella, saying it would be good to spend some time together as a family before finalizing everything. Family time. The irony wasn't lost on me. I agreed, my voice calm as I asked what time I should arrive. He added that they truly appreciated how gracefully I was handling everything and said their father would be proud. If only he knew what Harold had really thought about his sons. As I ended the call and continued driving toward what would likely be my final dinner as part of the Langford family, I realized that something inside me had shifted. The grief and confusion were still there, but now they were mixed with something sharper, something more focused. Chloe and Arthur believed they were in control, convinced they were outsmarting a grieving widow and pushing her into decisions before she could think clearly. They had no idea that their father had been 10 steps ahead of them all along. And they certainly had no idea that I was about to be 10 steps ahead of them too. Dinner was going to be very interesting indeed. Arthur and Isabella's house in Granite Bay was a monument to borrowed money and false success. As I pulled into their circular driveway, I couldn't help but notice the new luxury cars, a BMW and a Mercedes, that clearly cost more than most people made in a year. Now I understood where the money had come from. Isabella opened the door wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. At 38, she had perfected the art of looking expensively maintained, highlights that cost $600 every 8 weeks, nails that required weekly touch-ups, and jewelry that sparkled with the kind of stones that came with insurance riders. She greeted me enthusiastically, pulling me into an air kiss that barely touched my cheek and saying that I looked wonderful while asking how I was holding up. The concern in her voice sounded about as genuine as her nail color, but I smiled and played along, telling her I was managing and thanking her for having me. Chloe was already there, lounging in Arthur's study with a glass of scotch in his hand that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The room was filled with dark wood and leather, clearly designed to project success and stability. Now that I knew the truth, it felt more like a display of desperate overreach. He stood up and gave me a brief hug, saying that I was looking better and that he had been concerned after our conversation the previous day. The same conversation where he had made it clear that I was essentially left with nothing. Arthur came out of the kitchen holding a glass of what looked like a very expensive Chardonnay, saying he was glad I could make it and mentioning that Isabella had been cooking all afternoon, proudly referring to her herb-crusted salmon. The three of them moved around me like perfect hosts, offering drinks and appetizers, complimenting my appearance and asking about my plans. It was a carefully performed display of family concern, and if I hadn't spent the afternoon reading about their debts and failed business ventures, I might have believed it. Dinner was served in their formal dining room, complete with china that looked like it belonged in a museum and silverware heavy enough to feel like weapons. Isabella had indeed outdone herself. The salmon was perfectly prepared, the wine expertly paired, and the presentation flawless. As we settled into the main course, Chloe mentioned that Gregory Hayes had called him that afternoon, and that he understood I was ready to move forward with the estate transfer. I took a small, careful bite of salmon, buying myself a moment, and said that I had decided that fighting over Harold's wishes was not how I wanted to spend my remaining years, adding that family harmony mattered more to me than money. The relief that crossed Arthur's face was almost comical. He responded quickly, saying that it was wonderful, truly wonderful, and that their father would be pleased to see everyone working together. Isabella reached for a manila folder that had been sitting on the sideboard, and explained that they had prepared some papers to make everything official, mentioning that their attorney had drawn them up to complement what Gregory was handling. Their attorney? Of course they had. I responded politely but didn't touch the folder. Instead, I mentioned that I had been thinking about the medical bills. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Chloe set his wine glass down with slightly more force than necessary, while Arthur asked what I meant, keeping his voice carefully neutral. I explained that $180,000 was a substantial amount, and suggested that perhaps an accountant should review the estate's liquid assets before I agreed to take on that debt personally. Chloe and Arthur exchanged a look, the same kind of silent communication I had seen before, but this time I understood it. They were afraid I might discover something. Chloe carefully reminded me that the estate assets were tied up in probate, and that the medical bills were separate from the inheritance. I agreed pleasantly, adding that Harold had always been meticulous with his records, so there should be clear documentation showing exactly which debts belonged to the estate and which were considered personal responsibility. Isabella let out a light laugh, though it sounded slightly forced, brushing it off by saying that Arthur handled all those financial details. Arthur quickly nodded and confirmed that everything had been properly categorized, repeating that the medical expenses fell to me as Harold's spouse, since I had been involved in the treatment decisions. I said that made sense, but added that I found it interesting that Harold had never seemed worried about medical costs. He had always been confident that we had adequate insurance. The silence stretched just a moment too long. Chloe cleared his throat and explained that insurance didn't cover everything, especially given how extensive Harold's treatment had been in those final months. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but I couldn't resist pushing just a little further. I said that I should probably contact the hospital directly. I said that I wanted to get an itemized breakdown of what was owed and what the insurance had actually covered. Arthur's fork clattered against his plate. He quickly insisted that it wasn't necessary, explaining that he had already handled everything very thoroughly. I told him I was sure he had, but as Harold's widow, I felt responsible for understanding exactly what had happened financially during his final illness. It was, I added, the least I could do for his memory. Isabella suddenly stood up and offered dessert, mentioning the chocolate torte she had made from a food and wine recipe. She practically rushed to the kitchen, and I didn't miss the look Chloe gave Arthur. They were already unsettled, and I had barely started asking questions. Chloe leaned forward, adopting what was clearly meant to be a reassuring, almost paternal tone, and suggested that perhaps I was second-guessing our arrangement because of something someone else had said. He added that people unfamiliar with estate law could sometimes give misleading advice. I assured him that I wasn't second-guessing anything and explained that I was simply trying to be thorough, reminding him that Harold had always believed the details mattered. Arthur let out a nervous laugh and remarked that their father had always loved his paperwork. I agreed, adding that I had been going through his office and kept finding documents I didn't understand, bank statements from accounts I had never heard of, and business records for companies I didn't even know he had been involved in. The color drained from Arthur's face as he asked what kind of documents I meant. I downplayed it, saying it was probably nothing important, just confusing financial statements. Then I casually mentioned that I had found a safety deposit box key I had never seen before. Chloe went completely still. I continued, pointing out how strange it was. I had thought I knew all of Harold's financial arrangements, yet it seemed he had accounts and boxes I hadn't been aware of. I added that I should probably look into those before finalizing anything. The look that passed between the brothers this time was unmistakable. Pure panic, even though they tried to hide it. Chloe addressed me carefully, his voice strained as he tried to sound casual, suggesting that I shouldn't trouble myself with complicated paperwork and that such documents could be confusing without a business background. He offered that he and Arthur could review whatever I had found. I thanked him but declined, explaining that I believed Harold would have wanted me to understand everything myself, especially since I would now be managing on my own. Isabella returned with the dessert, her smile looking slightly forced. As she served it, the conversation shifted to safer topics: the weather, Arthur's latest consulting project, Chloe's law practice. But beneath it all, the tension remained, like an electrical current waiting to spark. After dinner, as I got ready to leave, Chloe walked me to my car. He brought up the documents again, suggesting that I bring them to our next meeting so they could help me sort through what mattered and what didn't, adding that Harold's filing system had not always been logical. I smiled at him, the same polite smile I had worn all evening, and agreed, saying that family should help family. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the driveway with his phone already to his ear. Whatever call he was making clearly couldn't wait. By the time I got home, my own phone was ringing. The number was unfamiliar. The caller introduced himself as Daniel Carter from Carter & Associates, and said he believed I might have documents connected to his office. I asked how he knew I had found them. He explained that Harold had left very specific instructions, that if I discovered the safety deposit box, he was to contact me within 24 hours. He added that we needed to meet as soon as possible, because there were things about Harold's estate that I needed to know before signing anything with Chloe and Arthur. I asked what kind of things. He said they were things that would change everything. As I ended the call and looked around Harold's study, my study now, I realized that the invisible game I had been playing all evening was about to become very visible indeed. Chloe and Arthur thought they were manipulating a grieving widow, but they had no idea that their father had been playing a much longer and far more sophisticated game. Daniel Carter's office was nothing like Gregory Hayes's polished downtown suite. It was located in a modest building in Midtown Sacramento, and had the comfortable, lived-in feel of a place where real work happened rather than appearances being maintained. Carter himself was not what I expected. A soft-spoken man in his 60s, with kind eyes and hands that suggested he had worked for everything he had earned. He greeted me, stood from behind his cluttered desk, and thanked me for coming so quickly, inviting me to sit because there was a lot to discuss. I settled into the worn leather chair across from him, holding my purse tightly in my lap with Harold's letter inside. and admitted that I was confused about everything. I admitted that I hadn't even known Harold had hired another attorney. Carter explained that Harold had brought him in about 8 months earlier. At first, it had only been to conduct a discreet investigation into some financial irregularities Harold had noticed. But as more information came to light, his role had expanded significantly. He opened a thick file, and I saw copies of many of the same documents I had already found in the safety deposit box, along with others I hadn't seen before. He said that my husband had been extremely thorough, and when he realized what his sons were planning, he had developed a detailed strategy, not only to protect me, but to make sure they faced consequences for their actions. I asked if the investigation had shown that they were stealing from him. Carter nodded grimly and explained that Chloe had been forging Harold's signature on loan documents, using the family business as collateral to cover his gambling debts. Arthur, he said, had gone even further, systematically transferring money from client accounts into shell companies he controlled. Both of them, he added, were facing serious legal consequences if their actions came to light. A chill ran through me as he listed the possible charges: grand larceny, wire fraud, elder abuse. Harold could have had them arrested. Instead, he had chosen something far more calculated. Carter laid out another set of documents across the desk: real estate records for the house and the Lake Tahoe property. He explained that about 6 months earlier, both properties had been leveraged to their maximum. Harold had taken out mortgages totaling $1,200,000 on the house and $800,000 on the villa. I asked why he would do that since we had owned both properties outright. Carter explained that Harold knew Chloe and Arthur expected to inherit them, and he wanted to make sure they also inherited the debts attached to them. The money from those mortgages, he added, had been moved into the Langford Holdings account, an account only I could access. I tried to process what that meant. So, if they inherited the properties, they would receive assets worth about $1,600,000, but with mortgages totaling $2 million. That meant they would owe $600,000 more than the properties were worth. I said that couldn't be possible. They had already shown me the will. Carter gently explained that what they had shown me was an outdated version, replaced by a final will Harold had signed 6 weeks before his death. The real will, he said, left everything to me with the option, entirely my choice, to give anything to Chloe and Arthur if I wished. He handed me a copy. As I read, one clause stood out clearly. It stated that the decision of what, if anything, his sons would inherit was left entirely to me, trusting my judgment to decide what they truly deserved. I said quietly that Harold had left it up to me. Carter confirmed that he had, and added that there was more. He explained that the life insurance policy was not for $200,000, but for $500,000, and that there was an additional policy worth $300,000 that Chloe and Arthur knew nothing about. $800,000. Combined with the money Harold had already secured, I realized that I wasn't just stable. I was financially secure. Carter then emphasized the most important point. Harold had documented everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every lie his sons had told during his illness. If I chose to pursue legal action, there was more than enough evidence to ensure convictions. The full weight of it settled over me. Harold hadn't just protected me. He had given me the power to decide what would happen to his sons. I asked what would happen if I chose not to pursue charges and also chose not to give them the properties. Carter explained that in that case they would receive nothing. No assets, only whatever memories and relationship they had left. Meanwhile, they would still face their existing debts, and the creditors expecting repayment would not be patient. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Chloe. Carter advised me not to answer yet, saying there were still things I needed to understand. But the phone kept ringing, and something about the urgency made me uneasy. I finally picked up. Chloe's voice sounded strained, almost panicked. He said we needed to talk immediately and that something had come up. I asked what kind of development. He explained that someone from Carter and Associates had contacted Arthur that morning, claiming to have documents that overrode the will they had been using. He said it was deeply concerning and suggested that someone might be trying to interfere with the estate. I glanced at Carter, who was quietly shaking his head, almost amused. Chloe urged me to come to Gregory Hayes's office right away so everything could be sorted out before I signed anything or made decisions I might regret. The urgency in his voice said everything. They had realized something was wrong. I told him I would be there in an hour, and then I ended the call. Carter explained that their father had been far wealthier than either of them had realized, adding that he had quietly built a portfolio over the years to ensure Vanessa's security after his death. He spread documents across the table: bank statements, investment records, property deeds. The house they believed they were inheriting had a $1,200,000 mortgage against it. The villa at Lake Tahoe carried $800,000 in liens. Their father had taken out those loans specifically to saddle any inheritance with debt. Chloe's face shifted from pale to gray as he said it was a lie. Carter calmly responded that it was not, explaining that their father had documented everything carefully, including Chloe's gambling debts, $230,000 owed to various creditors, and Arthur's fraudulent investment schemes, which had cost his clients nearly $300,000. Arthur reacted sharply, his voice cracking as he called it harassment and insisted that none of it could be proven. Carter smiled slightly and produced another folder, explaining that it could indeed be proven: bank records showing forged signatures on loan documents, wire transfer records confirming embezzlement, and recorded phone conversations where both of them discussed manipulating their father's estate while he was in the hospital. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Gregory Hayes stared at the documents with a stunned expression. Chloe turned to me, his voice now openly desperate, insisting that I shouldn't believe any of it and reminding me that we were family. I repeated the word family, recalling how they had treated me, telling me I would receive $20,000 after 22 years of marriage, and giving me 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Isabella, who had remained silent until then, suddenly spoke up, saying it was all a misunderstanding and that things could be worked out. I interrupted and said there was nothing to work out. The real will, the legally binding one, left everything to me, and the decision of what, if anything, Chloe and Arthur would inherit was entirely mine. I reached into my purse and took out another document, explaining that it was a gift deed I had prepared that morning, and that I was giving them exactly what they had tried to give me. Chloe grabbed the document and read it quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding and then to horror. Arthur slowly realized what it meant: they were being given the house and the villa, but with the mortgages. I confirmed it. They would own properties worth approximately $1,600,000, with debts totaling $2 million, leaving them $600,000 in the negative, which seemed fitting given their existing financial situation. Chloe said I couldn't do that, though his voice lacked certainty. I replied that I could, and that it was exactly what Harold had intended. He wanted them to face the consequences of their actions. Gregory Hayes finally spoke, suggesting that the situation was highly irregular, and that perhaps more time should be taken to consider all options. I said firmly that I had already considered everything. Chloe and Arthur could either accept the inheritance as it was or walk away with nothing. Arthur asked what would happen if they refused. Daniel Carter answered that criminal charges would follow: elder abuse, grand larceny, and wire fraud, and that the evidence was overwhelming. He added that they would be facing significant prison time. The silence stretched on. Chloe seemed to be searching for a way out, while Arthur looked defeated. Finally, Chloe asked what I wanted from them. I said that I wanted them to sign the papers accepting the inheritance, agree never to contact me again except through attorneys, and understand that this outcome was their father's decision, not out of hatred, but because of their actions. Isabella began to cry, saying it would ruin them and that they would lose everything. I told her they should have thought about that before taking advantage of their dying father. Arthur looked at me with something that resembled respect and said that Harold had planned everything in detail. I replied that their father had been far smarter than they had ever given him credit for. In the end they signed. They had no choice. As they left the conference room, Chloe paused at the door and said that it wasn't over. I replied calmly that it was completely over. 3 months later, I sold the real estate that Chloe and Arthur couldn't afford to keep and moved to a charming cottage in Carmel, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The cottage cost $1.2 million in cash, and even after that I still had more money than I could ever spend in several lifetimes. Through my attorney, I later learned that Chloe had filed for bankruptcy and was attending court-mandated counseling for his gambling addiction. Arthur had moved back in with his mother and taken a job as a night manager at a hotel near the airport. Isabella had filed for divorce and relocated to Los Angeles to live with her sister. Sometimes, usually in the evenings when the ocean fog rolled in, I would think about Harold and wonder whether he would approve of how everything had unfolded. Then I would remember his letter, his careful planning, and his determination to protect me even after he was gone. I believe he would have been very satisfied. The cottage came with a beautiful garden that had been neglected by the previous owners. I spent my days restoring it, planting roses like the ones Harold and I once grew together, creating herb gardens and flower beds that bloomed in thoughtful succession throughout the year. It was peaceful, deeply satisfying work, something entirely different from the 22 years I had spent managing other people's expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I was responsible only for myself. I joined the local gardening club, enrolled in watercolor classes at the community college, and began volunteering at an animal shelter. These were simple things, but after years of living for others, they felt transformative. One afternoon, while trimming roses in the front garden, a young woman stopped at the gate. She looked to be about 30, with kind eyes and a slightly hesitant smile. She introduced herself as Emily Carter, Daniel Carter's daughter, and explained that her father had suggested I might be interested in some volunteer opportunities. I set down my pruning shears and walked over to speak with her, asking what kind of opportunities she meant. She told me she worked with women trying to escape abusive situations, financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and similar struggles, and that her father believed I might understand what they were going through. I thought about the person I had been just a few months earlier, confused, uncertain, and convinced I had no power of my own. I told her that I probably did understand. She smiled and offered to explain more about their work. As we spoke, I realized that Harold's final gift had not only been financial security. He had given me something far more valuable: the understanding that I was stronger than I had ever believed, more capable than anyone had assumed, and able to protect both myself and others. 2 months later, I established the Harold Langford Foundation for Financial Justice, dedicated to providing legal support and financial education for victims of financial abuse within families. It wasn't the legacy Chloe and Arthur had expected, but it was exactly the legacy Harold would have wanted. Now, I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites. They will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.